author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're lucky to have with us longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. And we're all set for our Super Tuesday Fallout special. What lies ahead on the road to the White House? Thanks for being here, Tim.
Well, always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Tim, if I know you half as well as I think I do, you've spent the entire day poring over the percentages and the margins for Super Tuesday. But like myself, I spent hours putting together my little Excel document so I could figure out leads and whatnot. But the reality is this was always going to be a two-horse race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, wasn't it?
Well, I think most of us made the mistake at the beginning of this Republican campaign of thinking that this was an open primary, that Ron DeSantis could win, Nikki Haley could win, even Vivek Ramaswamy was on the rise. It seemed that Trump was old news and that there was just too much baggage attached to him. But I think we all got it wrong because this is essentially an incumbent running for re-election. And part of the reason I say that is because Nikki Haley gave an excellent account of herself in this campaign. She did about as well as she possibly could. So yes, part of this is the fact that Haley really ran a very good campaign and yet she never had a chance. She was lost on Super Tuesday by an average of almost 50 points. And I don't mean she got almost 50%. I mean, she lost by almost 50% on average. And that speaks more to the continued dominance of Donald Trump. And I don't think anybody really thought that he could take 1 foot out of what seemed to be the political grave and not only win the nomination, but be favored to win the general election. I mean, it's a remarkable comeback story. I think it's going to go down sort of next to Richard Nixon, who in 1962, having already lost the presidency in the gubernatorial race in California, said you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. And of course, 6 years later, he was sitting in the White House. So this has to go down as one of the great comeback stories. And the narrative for Trump is very much on the line here. You know, as I've said, if he wins this election, he will be seen by historians as the single dominant figure who changed politics in a very tangible way. If he loses, he will be seen as someone who won a fluke election and then brought his party low in 3 or 4 cycles after that, from which the party will have some real trouble recovering. So there's an enormous disparity between if Trump wins or if Trump loses, not the least of which is if he wins, he goes to the White House. If he loses, he almost surely will go to prison. That's a pretty good incentive to run a good campaign, I would say.
Yeah, as our legal affairs editor, Scott DeCassandra, often points out, winning the presidency is Donald Trump's best legal defense right now. Something I want to pick up, actually a couple of things I want to pick up on what you just said there, Tim. You talked about the Tricky Dicky, Richard Nixon, and how he staged this comeback. But there was there's another similarity to another election, and it was the 1912 election, which I believe is the only time we've had an incumbent versus a president. So it's essentially 2 presidents running against each other. That was Howard Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. And so it's almost, as we like to say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Well, you had that was sort of an intra-Republican Party battle between Taft and Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt. He was
Teddy
the
Roosevelt,
Republican
the
Roosevelt,
Bull
as
Moose
opposed
Party.
to
Yeah.
and then the Bull Moose Party.
Mm.
But he miscalculated. He thought that Taft would simply continue his policies and do everything he wanted. And when he didn't, he tried to come back at him. And that resulted in the disaster of the Woodrow Wilson presidency. And right now, Nikki Haley is in a position where she, to some degree, controls the non-Trump wing
Mm.
of the Republican Party. And the degree of enthusiasm she expresses is going to be important. But at this point, I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
the deficits for Joe Biden are almost unspeakably bad in every single area. The only place where he has an advantage is in abortion. And I think Trump has a very clear plan to depict Biden and the Democrats as the true extremists when it comes to abortion, wanting the right for a woman to abort a pregnancy right up to the point of birth. And that can be presented as an extreme policy. So I mean, uh, Biden's presidency has just been an abject failure. And it's almost gotten to the point, Mark, where I think the fact of Trump being the competitor may not even matter. It could be any Republican.
well, of course, yeah. Now there are no more Republicans in the race, with
Correct.
Nikki Haley dropping out during the week after her. Admittedly, it was a good show. It was a good show that she did. You know, she won Vermont, although that was with, I reckon that was with the help of a lot of Democrat votes, because it's an open primary system on that. But we're going to talk about the numbers, the Joe Biden versus Donald Trump rematch after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on this Liberty Nation radio special with longtime host of the show, Tim Donner. We were talking about Super Tuesday results a little while ago, but now I'd really like to move on to the actual numbers. Now, again, I did say this almost exact same sentence in the first segment of the show, Tim, but if I know you half as well as I think I do, somewhere on your computer there, you have Real Clear Politics polling open up on a few tabs. Am I right or wrong?
I refuse to divulge. Hey, look, you know, a workman can't share his secrets or he won't continue to work.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. We're not building stucco walls here,
Look,
Tim.
we are starting to be drowned in numbers because, you know, the article that I wrote on LibertyNation.com is a Super Tuesday preview, really says it all. It's an end and a beginning.
Yes.
The primary race is over. Internal opposition for either Biden or Trump are finished. And now you've got an 8-month presidential election campaign. I mean, it seems to me that Donald Trump's strategy should basically be what they used to call in college basketball a four-corner strategy, where you freeze the ball, you pass it around to the four corners, and you don't take a shot. You just run the clock down. And that's really
I'm not a basketball watcher, so I didn't, but I ended up run the clock down. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, basically freeze the ball. Or like in football parlance, you know, run the clock down to 1 second on the play clock, then take a knee and let it run again. In other words, the point is that Trump, at this point, it's more a matter of what he needs not to do than what he needs to do. Everybody knows about his presidency. Everybody knows about his temperament, but he has a chance to soften the temperament issue. And if he does that at all, he should be able to be on a glide path to the White House, if only because Joe Biden has become completely unelectable. I just don't see any path for him.
Let's talk about temperament for a second, because Donald Trump is well, he's famous for it internationally. You know, even in North Korea, he's famous for his temperament. But there's a lot of internet chatter and from some serious news organizations that are saying that Joe Biden is planning on, and I think I've got this right, he's planning on goading Trump on a daily basis in the hopes that Trump will implode and get angry and make a fool of himself. But the point that you make that I mean, the real thing that has put people off Donald Trump is not his policies. Well, not conservative voters anyway, and certainly not Republican voters. It's not his policies, but his temperament and his attitude. But do you think that the Democrat voters who are sticking with Joe Biden as of now, do you think if they see the same kind of, well, let's call it petulance, I guess is the best word to describe, if they see that kind of snarky petulance coming out of the president of the United States on a daily basis aimed at a political opponent, do you think they'll think, well, there's really no difference between the two of them in terms of temperament? Do you think it'll backfire?
Certainly, because everybody knows the staggering deficits that Joe Biden is facing in the polls, in the battleground states, on the economy, especially on the border, on crime, on inflation. He's underwater on every single issue.
Yeah.
And it's clear the only thing he's got, he used to have this argument about the death of democracy, but I don't see him being able to even use that now that his cohorts have done everything to try and remove Trump from the ballot and get him thrown into a cage before election day.
Yeah.
I think that you can't use democracy effectively anymore. And abortion is all he's got. We talked about how that can be depicted as an extreme position among Democrats who want it right up to the point of birth. So what is he left with? He's left simply with scorched earth, warning the American people that we will lose the democracy and have a dictatorship. He'll skip right to the dictatorship since he's limiting democracy by trying to get Trump off the ballot so people don't even have the choice to face him.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up. Well, maybe not. That's so funny. It's because after the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 in a per curiam decision as well, meaning that they really spoke with one voice on that particular issue that the state couldn't remove, Colorado couldn't remove Donald Trump from the ballot, although they had some issues further down the line with the scope. But immediately after that, Jamie Raskin called the court illegitimate, so they weren't doing a proper job, and there was a lot of talk about from other people who were opposed to the decision that the Supreme Court needed to go. And Jamie Raskin is, I believe, crafting legislation or recrafting legislation they brought out in 2022, tried to bring out 2022, to label January 6th an insurrection and therefore just broad sweep disqualify anybody who had an involvement in it. And that involvement, notably, and I think this is quite funny, includes people who objected to the certification of the election. Now, here's the irony. 2016, who objected to the certification of the election? Jamie Raskin.
Jamie Raskin. Yes, I mean, look, if there was shame in politics, it wouldn't be politics. He's utterly shameless, just like people like Adam Schiff, who just won the Senate primary or went into the runoff in California. Yeah. People like this can just lie with absolute impunity. But it's amazing to me that Jamie Raskin doesn't realize that what he's proposing is as a way to kick Trump out of office before he ever takes it by challenging the outcome of the election because he's an insurrectionist. He's doing exactly what the left has been accusing Donald Trump of for the last 4 years. It's amazing, the tone deafness. Imagine the average person hearing this saying, wait a minute, is this Democrat? Is this high-ranking Democrat? I believe he's third in line in the House, third-ranking Democrat. Is he saying that if Trump wins, then we'll just find a way to decertify the election? Because that's what he's saying, and that's exactly what they have accused Trump of doing. So, you know,
It's like,
projection, my name is the
hmm.
Democratic Party.
Well, as the great sage and philosopher Groucho Marx once said, if they didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards at all.
And then he also said, I've got a lot of principles, and if you don't like them, I've got other principles. That's
We could
Jamie
just do
Raskin.
Groucho Marx quotes the entire show. I'm in.
Jamie Raskin is Groucho Marx. We've created a new meme.
Yeah, without the humor, without the humor.
Definitely not.
Something I want to come back to, Tim. I've been making notes on the many wonderful points you've been making, but you briefly mentioned the records that they're running on here, the two candidates, the two presumptive candidates, I guess they are now. Uh, uh, and in 2020, Donald Trump had a record as president. And for 3 years, it was arguably quite a good record. And then came COVID. And then he lost a lot of support there, I think, for his reaction to it. But Joe Biden was able to say whatever he wanted because he didn't have a record as president to run on. So any faults or foibles that could be brought up to be used as ammunition against him, well, he wasn't president. Barack Obama was president. But now he's got the track record. And I think that creates a completely different arena for this election because it's record v. record. And I mean, you've said yourself in the polls, pretty much every area except abortion, Donald Trump beats him on those because it's records that are running now, not so much personalities.
That's exactly right. And there's actually, even the New York Times is admitting there's some semblance of nostalgia for the Trump years because of how the economy was roaring really on all cylinders until COVID just destroyed everything for a period of time and probably cost Trump re-election. But I look at it this way. It's the reverse of 2020. In 2020, it was really a referendum on Trump, up or down. And Biden was considered the so-called normal choice who would tone things down and create a sense of normalcy. So it was a referendum on Trump. This time, it's a referendum on Biden. And if it remains that way, Biden's going to lose, plain and simple.
Yeah, I've been looking at the recent figures. I believe nationally, Trump is up by 2% on national polling for a two-horse race. He's also up when it's a three-horse race. I think it's 2.3%. So when it's a five-horse race, so including RFK, Cornel West, and somebody else.
And remember that most of those, well, certainly Cornel West and Jill Stein will get votes from the left, and that will cost Biden. But these things always happen. For example, it's largely gone unnoticed that in 2020, the Libertarian candidate won more votes in Michigan, I believe it was Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona, than Trump's margin of defeat. So, Trump could say, hey, if the Libertarian hadn't run, I would be back in the White House. So there's always, there was
it's a game of margins.
2020. Yeah.
A game of margins. We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we've been running the gamut on the Super Tuesday results, the Biden-Trump records. Now let's devote a little bit of time to the departed candidates of Super Tuesday, and that was most notably Miss Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina, former UN ambassador, and she quit, and she did not, in her recusal speech, I guess you might call it, endorse Donald Trump directly. She congratulated him and said that it was up to him to earn the trust of voters, but she's not backing him as of the time of recording. She's not offered her full-throated endorsement. What do you think that means?
Well, I think it's a bit of a come hither type of move, which is that if she gives away her endorsement now, she loses any leverage that she might have with Trump. She has won a few delegates. She does represent the non-Trump wing of the party. She also, even though she is a true conservative, she is not a rhino, which some people have
Mm.
said she is, but she is more of a traditional George W. Bush style conservative. Um, you hold out your endorsement because you're hoping that Donald Trump will maybe make some concessions, maybe ask her to be VP, even though she said she's not interested and he said he won't take her. You know, this is
So,
politics.
sorry,
Things can
Tim, if
change
I
in
could just,
5 minutes.
sorry to interrupt you, Tim. I'm sure I know you've seen it, and I'm sure m many of our readers, watchers, and viewers and listeners have. But there's a British show called Yes, Prime Minister, and Yes, Minister. It's a prequel, and in that it's about the bureaucracy versus the politicians, and it's wonderful. It's good, clean humor, but it 30 years down the line, it still rings as true as a bell.
It's
But
because it's human nature
it's
and it's
human nature.
politics, and that doesn't change.
But
Yeah.
there's one key part in it where I believe that one of the politicians said, "No, I'm absolutely not running." And then off to the side, the two of them look at each other and go, "Oh my God, he's running!" When they say they're not doing, and that seems to me that that could
Yes.
also be the Haley situation. She'd be willing to accept a position. I don't think vice president, though. I think they've both made a bit of a stamp down on that. But she could be the queen of foreign affairs, couldn't she?
She could. I mean, she says a UN ambassador under her belt. I suppose she could be Secretary of State, though she doesn't have extensive foreign policy experience outside of her 2 years as UN ambassador. Look, I think the future is up to her. There's two ways this could go. If Trump wins, okay, then she's going to have to kind of if she runs again, which I don't see why she wouldn't. I
Mm.
mean, she stays in this long to build a base. She's raised money. She can put a lot of it aside for another run. But I think that she needs to, basically play ball with Trump in just the right way
Mm.
while maintaining her independence. And I think if Trump wins, she's going to have to adjust a little bit her message in 2028. But if Trump loses, then I think the whole deck is cleared and we start all over in terms of whether the Republican Party is going to go back to a more traditional form of conservatism or not. And I think that is the critical factor in Nikki Haley's future. But she's the first Republican woman ever to win a primary,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
she outlasted seven impressive men. So I think, and you know what, Mark, the other thing is she's extremely popular with women.
Mm.
And I mean, that gives her a real leg up for 2028 and probably gives Donald Trump pause about whether he ought to try to convince her to get on the ticket. Be a little hard though now that she's criticized him so much. She'll just be asked constantly during the campaign, but you said he was too old, but you said he
Yeah.
drove the deficit up too much, but this sort of thing.
Yeah. Speak it haste, repent in leisure. Somebody we're not really talking about is Ron DeSantis, who, and I think you and I both agree on this. If Donald Trump had not been in this race, this would have been Ron DeSantis's to lose. He could
Yes.
have, as long as he didn't screw everything up so too badly. He had the support of the let's call it the MAGA base, but he also has a lot of support amongst the more traditional Republicans, as you say, like the G.W. Bush style Republicans. They like him too because he's got governor experience and has done a very, very impressive job, not just of running Florida, but of taking people along with him on his coattails. and getting people into office. So I find it funny that we're not really talking about Ron DeSantis, but we're all talking about Nikki Haley. Now, do you think that's because, as you pointed out, she did outlast 7 other candidates?
Well, I think that Ron DeSantis, um, he would have had a competitive race with Nikki Haley, and I think he probably would have won if it was the two of them. Then, of course, there was Ramaswamy, Vivek Ramaswamy, who made a good impression, and a few leftover votes for Chris Christie and the like. But
Who? Sorry.
the former governor of New
Oh,
Jersey,
yeah, that guy.
I know it's easy to forget. He didn't win a primary, but
Mm.
a Democrat that nobody had ever heard of, who'd never even visited American Samoa, was able to beat Joe Biden
Jason
in
Palmer.
American
Jason
territory.
Palmer.
Jason Palmer. He's got stories to tell for the rest of his
Oh
life.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
imagine that.
The
But
only man to beat Joe Biden in the Democratic Party
exactly.
primary. I mean, this time round, of course, but lots of people have beaten Joe Biden in previous presidential primaries. It's
that's for
almost Joe
sure.
Biden's thing, right? Um,
Well, I mean, I think he's proven why his campaign, fell flat on its face in 1988
mm,
and in 2008. The guy was a terrible candidate. In 2020, he was fortunate he had to just show up, not say anything, do anything, or go anywhere, and let Trump defeat himself. And he lucked into it. And yet, look, I'll make one other point that I think is key to make here. You know, in terms of pride goeth before the fall, Joe Biden could have called it quits and passed the baton after the midterms of 2022 when Democrats exceeded expectations. And in 2020, of course, he had knocked Donald Trump out of the White House. He could have retired as a heroic figure in the Democratic
mm.
Party if he had done the right thing and fulfilled his implicit promise that he was going to be merely a transitional figure. But his hubris, his power went to his head, and now his legacy stands to be as, let's put it this way, one that makes Jimmy Carter look like George Washington.
I love that. I love that. There's another meme. We are building memes here. Those of you at
We
home
are.
listening in, if you're good at making memes, send them along to libertynation.com. We'll be back after this short break where we're going to talk battleground states, my favorite topic. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network with senior political analyst of libertynation.com, Tim Donner. Now, we've been talking the primaries. We've been talking Joe Biden versus Donald Trump records in office. We've been talking 2028 prospects for Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, the general Republican field, and, of course, Joe Biden's legacy. But now it's time to get down to the nitty-gritty, as they say. There's an election coming up in exactly 8 months. I'm sure everybody's aware of that one. It has been in a few newspapers. It has been on a few broadcasts. But of course, what I think is probably one of the most important things here, Tim, is what's going to happen in battleground states, those places that could swing either blue or red on election day. Because although Donald Trump has a 2-point advantage nationally, a lot of those races don't even really matter which the candidate is because, California, New York are going to go Democrat. Alabama, Florida, they're going to go red. That's pretty clear. But there's a number of states that, could go either way, and that's where the elections are decided, Tim. So what's the latest there?
Well, there were thought to be 7 battleground states, and that was pretty accurate. I guess you could still call North Carolina a battleground state, but I think the chances of Trump losing there are minimal. You have a solid lead for Trump of between 4 and 6 points in Arizona, in Georgia, in Michigan. And the big surprise to me, so far in the polling, Mark, has been Nevada,
Mm.
because Trump lost that twice. He lost it to Hillary Clinton, he lost it to Joe Biden, and he's up by about 7.5 points there. So something's happening in Nevada. Now, the only battleground states where Biden is at least roughly even with Trump are Wisconsin and Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
So you've got 7 states. If Trump wins the 4 that he's comfortably ahead in, he wins the election, even if he doesn't win Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. Basically, he if he wins 4 of those 7 battleground states without going deep into the weeds, he wins 4 of those 7, he wins the election. Now, on the other hand, he could possibly, very possibly, win all 7, at which point, if he thinks that he's that far ahead, he's going to, it seems to me, now we're getting ahead of ourselves, but he's going to attempt to generate a true mandate by spending time in places that are light blue, like Virginia,
Mm.
like Minnesota, like New Hampshire, like Maine, to see if he can run up the margin. But I can tell you this flat out. He never once led in the popular vote in 2016 or 2020.
Mm.
And now he's ahead by 2 points. It basically says if he stays ahead in the popular vote, he's going to win the election. It's just that.
I want to talk about Minnesota there, Tim, because it's somewhere it's often overlooked because this is off the top of my head here, but Minnesota, Ronald Reagan didn't win that in his 49 state landslide. He missed Minnesota and DC. And the last person to win it, I
And of
think,
course,
was
that's because Walter Mondale, his opponent, was
Minnesota.
from
Yeah,
Minnesota. And he won it by like about 3,000
yeah,
votes. It was very close to a 50-state sweep.
it was, except for DC, of course, but that's not a
For
state.
DC, I mean, that's
Uh,
never in play.
so 1976, Richard Nixon, I think, was the last Republican to win Minnesota. Uh, but
You've been
this,
saying 68, 72. Yeah. In 72, because he pulled a similar
mm,
landslide in 72 as Reagan did in 84.
yeah, so the thing with Minnesota, I think this is really important, is the uncommitted voters. Now, there's a lot of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans in Michigan, and they did an uncommitted vote, and that was 13% of the Democrat primary voters. And that was in response, obviously, that was a protest to Joe Biden's essentially his support for Israel and for not backing Palestine. But then you go to Minnesota, where there's a smaller percentage in terms of Arab American, Muslim American voters, but it was 20%, almost 20%
Yeah.
voted uncommitted. Now that campaign had only really been running a week, and they only spent, as far as I can tell, they only spent about $20,000 to get that out, which means it's actually possibly unlike the Michigan one. In Minnesota, it was actually a grassroots campaign.
Well,
Now,
people are assuming
mm,
somehow that the none of the above choice or uncommitted is because of his position on the Israel-Hamas war. But I think a good part of it is because he's just been a terrible president,
mm,
honestly, and it's a way to deliver a shot across the bow, if nothing else, that boy, we got to do better than this guy if we expect to keep Trump out of the White House.
that's what I think it is. I think it's essentially it's a bit of a groundswell, and it's a way of telling Democrats we're not Democrat voters of telling Democrats we're not happy. You foisted Joe Biden upon us when I think it's clear to most people that there's some issues, there's some cognitive issues, and I don't think anybody's really buying all the talk that it's Donald Trump who's and I've heard this in the media. Donald Trump is suffering from dementia. It's Donald Trump who has aphasia.
And all of that does is
Yeah,
draw more
it does.
attention to the issue for Joe Biden. I mean, it's just really
Mm.
political malpractice, just like naming Bidenomics, which put an exact face on his economic failures and inflation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
There's a
best to just
Bidenomics.
let it be a little more vague than that. You
Yeah.
know?
So with Minnesota, I think that it's potentially in play if Donald Trump can boost his 2% nationally that he has now to maybe 3%, 3.5%. I think Minnesota's actually in play. And if that's in play, then anywhere is
Well,
in
yes.
play.
Well, let's put it this way. There's a couple of signs when a campaign is about to lose or about to win. The sign of a campaign that's about to lose is when someone has to go and appeal to what should be his base that should
Mm.
already be committed, and he should be seeking to expand his base. But Biden is losing his base. He's way down with blacks, with Hispanics, with women, with young people. Um, so, you know, if he has to continue to appeal to those people, then he'll lose. Um, on the other hand, with Trump, right, if he starts spending time in Minnesota and Virginia and New Hampshire and places like that, or even Colorado, that's a sign that he's confident he's going to win because now he's interested in expanding the electoral count because you can claim more of a mandate if you win the electoral college by 100 votes than if you win by one.
Tim, I think that one word there that you use really hits the nail on the head, mandate. We've discussed this before on the show that Joe Biden has been governing like he has a huge Reagan-esque 84 mandate from the nation when it really wasn't that kind of mandate.
At all.
Yeah, it
It
really
was
wasn't.
all it was he's not Trump. That's the only mandate. He's the only choice other than Trump, and that's how he won. You know, but Trump could get a mandate if what he could present as a mandate, if only because of the abject weakness of
Mm.
his opponent.
Well, of course, and the fact that he's been invited back, there's obviously in the shopping world that there's buyer's remorse. A little different to caveat emptor, right? No, buyer beware, that's the right thing. But they've got the remorse on it, where he was in for 4 years, then he was out, and now they're saying, well, hey, he can just come back and say, you know what, I told you so.
Well, I
And
think, you know, if you think about it, when historians look back on this, if Trump wins here, then 2020 will kind of look like the fluke election that
mm,
he lost. If he loses this year, it'll look like 2016 was a fluke, right?
yeah, very very much so. It will be the hiccup in his
Yes.
presidency, and of
What
course,
I
I think
like to call a black swan event.
yeah, an electoral black swan event. I think that's a great point. Now, if you guys at home, you guys and gals at home, if you want to read more on the fallout of Super Tuesday, on the election analysis, go and check out Tim Donner's writing at libertynation.com or listen to more radio shows. You can catch them on site on YouTube, and we've even got our own Roku channel, which I highly recommend everybody goes and checks out. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much for being here with us today.
It's been fun. Thank you, Mark.
And that really is all we do have time for on this week's special edition, where we've been examining Super Tuesday, the candidates, the quandaries, all the numbers, and everything in between. I'd like to thank our special guest, Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this very radio show that you're listening to, either on the Radio America Network or anywhere where good podcasts are found. Now, I really would also like to thank you, the listeners at home who tune in, week out, and make all this worthwhile. Remember, you're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, which is proudly sponsored by libertynation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. I hope you'll be tuning in next week, where we'll be talking more liberty, more things that matter to you, and examining politics through the lens of the Constitution. Thanks for being here. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.